I found the document that would destroy my sister's carefully constructed lies, tucked inside my father's copy of Moby Dick. And in that moment, I realized Clara had turned his deathbed into a stage for the greatest theft of my life. The paper trembled in my hands as I read her handwritten notes in the margins. Notes that reduced me to a clinical A, an obstacle to be managed, a problem to be solved by cutting me out of everything our parents had promised to split equally between us. And I understood, with perfect clarity, that the sister who'd held my hand at our father's funeral had spent his final months systematically erasing me from his legacy. The air in my father's study felt thick enough to drown in. It smelled of old leather, lemon polish, and the faint, sweet ghost of pipe tobacco he'd given up years ago, but that still clung to the velvet curtains like a memory refusing to fade. Grief was a fine, invisible dust settling on every surface, coating the spines of his beloved history books and the polished brass of his desk lamp. I was supposed to be sorting through it all, separating memories to be cherished from paperwork to be discarded. Mom had asked me to handle this room, saying she couldn't bear to go through his things yet. Clara, ever practical, had already cleared out his office at the company, boxing up decades of work with her characteristic efficiency. This room, his personal sanctuary, had fallen to me. Instead of sorting, I stood frozen, my world having just tilted on its axis. A silent, violent geological shift that left me stranded in a landscape I no longer recognized. It was a single sheet of paper, but it contained a universe of betrayal. Not the final notarized will, but something far more intimate, far more damning. A preliminary draft from his lawyer, dated 6 months before he died. Typed at the top were the antiseptic words, estate planning adjustments. My eyes scanned the dense, dizzying columns of legal text, but it was the handwritten notes in the margins that made the air crystallize in my lungs. They were in my sister Clara's sharp, precise script, the same script from 100 birthday cards and passive-aggressive sticky notes on the fridge, the same handwriting that had penned "thinking of you" on condolence cards to friends, that had signed her name on the funeral guest book with a flourish. A needs stability, not a lump sum. Protect her from her own artistic whims. The business is the family legacy. It needs to be whole. She's never demonstrated financial responsibility. My name, Amelia, was abbreviated to a cold, clinical A, as if I were a variable in an equation she was solving. An obstacle to be managed, a problem requiring a solution. And there, next to the clause detailing the equal split of assets my parents had always promised, the bedrock principle of our family that I'd heard repeated at every birthday, every holiday, every family gathering, Clara had drawn a decisive, brutal line through my name. Below it, she'd scribbled a suggestion for a modest trust, one that would dispense a pittance each month, just enough to survive, but never, ever to thrive. It was a cage built from legal jargon, a gilded prison of low expectations, and my own sister was the architect. She'd even calculated the monthly amount in the margin, $1,000. $1,000 a month from an estate worth over $4 million. She thought I'd just fade away, a quaint artistic footnote in the grand story of our family's success, a story in which she was now the sole protagonist. But as I stood there in the suffocating silence of my father's study, the paper trembling in my hand, I felt not just the ice of betrayal, but the first slow volcanic burn of a quiet, unyielding fire. Before the dust of grief had settled, before this piece of paper had incinerated the past, my life was a comfortable if slightly frayed tapestry. I was a graphic designer working freelance from a small, sun-drenched apartment on the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse. The space smelled of oil paints, brewing coffee, and the sharp scent of turpentine. Scents that had become synonymous with home, with freedom, with the life I'd built on my own terms. My work was my passion, a world of color and form that my parents supported with gentle if slightly mystified pride. I designed book covers for independent publishers, created branding for local businesses, and occasionally sold my own abstract paintings at galleries around the city. It wasn't lucrative in the way Clara's corporate career was, but it paid my bills and filled my life with purpose. My father, Richard Jensen, a man who'd built a successful regional hardware supply company from a single storefront, saw the world in the comforting black and white of balance sheets. My art, to him, was a beautiful but baffling language he didn't speak. Numbers made sense. Profit margins made sense. The way I could spend 3 days perfecting the curve of a single letter in a logo design mystified him. But he tried. God, he tried. "As long as you're happy, Amelia," he'd say, his voice a low, reassuring rumble that could make you believe anything was possible. "Just make sure you're paying into your retirement account." Then he'd squeeze my shoulder, his hand rough and warm from years of manual work before the company grew, and I'd know that even if he didn't understand my choices, he supported them. My mother, Eleanor, was the bridge between our worlds. A former art history teacher who'd given up her career when Clara was born, she was the one who truly understood what I did. She'd framed my first gallery piece with an absurdly ornate gold frame she'd found at an estate sale, treating it with the same reverence she'd give a museum acquisition. She'd bought my father a book on Impressionism for his birthday, which he dutifully read, keeping a notepad beside it where he'd write down questions to ask her later. She believed in balance, in fairness, in the equal distribution of love and resources. "You and Clara," she'd often say, her hands clasped as if in prayer, "are two sides of the same coin. Both valuable, both essential. Your father and I, we've worked hard to make sure you'll both be taken care of, equal shares. That's only fair." It was her mantra, the bedrock of our family, repeated so often it became background music to our lives. I'd always believed it was my father's philosophy, too. Clara, 5 years my senior, was the other side of that coin, gleaming, practical, and impeccably polished. She joined my father's business right out of college with a degree in finance from a prestigious university, earning an MBA at night while working full-time, and quickly becoming his indispensable right hand. By the time she was 30, she was CFO. By 32, she was effectively running the company while Dad focused on the big-picture strategy he loved. She was the one who organized family holidays with itemized itineraries sent out weeks in advance. She managed our parents' appointments in a shared digital calendar that pinged reminders to all our phones. She spoke in a language of stock portfolios and 5-year plans, of market positioning and growth strategies. I admired her drive, her fierce competence, even when it felt like a quiet, constant judgment on my own less structured life. Our relationship was a dance of polite distance, a series of logistical check-ins rather than emotional connections. "Did you remember to get Dad's prescription?" she'd text. Never, "How are you?" or "I miss you." "Mom's birthday is next Friday. I've made a reservation at the Chestnut Grill. 7 p.m. Don't be late." Not, "Would you like to help me plan something special for Mom?" She managed the family like she managed the company, with a ruthless efficiency that left no room for error or for grace. I often felt less like a sister and more like a junior staff member who was perpetually behind on her duties, constantly disappointing her with my inability to be as organized, as forward-thinking, as successful as she was. The little digs, the subtle manipulations were there long before Dad got sick, but I'd dismissed them as just Clara being Clara. They were tiny paper cuts, not mortal wounds. When I was considering buying my apartment, she'd sent me a flurry of articles about the instability of the housing market and the hidden costs of homeownership, each one forwarded with a brief message. "Thought you should see this. I just worry about you getting in over your head, Amelia. Maybe renting is smarter for now. You have to think long-term." She'd said this over Sunday dinner, in front of our parents, her voice dripping with concern that made me look foolish for even considering the purchase. When a major design firm in the city showed interest in my portfolio, offering me a junior position with benefits and a steady salary, she'd mentioned to our parents over that same Sunday dinner table. "It's a very high-pressure environment, though. The hours are brutal. 80-hour weeks are standard. I hope she can handle it." She'd smiled at me then, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're so used to your flexible schedule, it might be quite a shock." I'd turned down the position, partly because of her warnings, partly because I loved my independence. I'd convinced myself it was my choice. Now I wondered how many of my choices had been shaped by her carefully planted doubts. She planted seeds so skillfully they looked like flowers of concern. Then Dad's diagnosis came: pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The words fell like an axe, cleaving our lives into a before and an after. The world shrank to the size of a hospital room, the scent of antiseptic and wilting flowers replacing the familiar comfort of his pipe tobacco and old books. The oncologist had given us a timeline, 6 months, maybe a year with aggressive treatment. Clara, true to form, took charge. She became a whirlwind of grim competence, coordinating with oncologists, battling with the insurance company, and updating family members with concise, emotionless emails that read like corporate memos. Father underwent second round of chemotherapy today. Prognosis remains unchanged. We'll provide updates as warranted. She was the general, waging a war of logistics, and in my grief-stricken state, I was grateful for her strength. I was the one who sat by his bedside for hours that stretched into days, sometimes bringing my laptop to work while he slept, but mostly just being present. I read to him from his favorite worn paperbacks. Steinbeck, Hemingway, the adventure novels he'd loved as a boy. I held a cup of water with a bent straw to his lips when his hands shook too much to hold it himself. I learned to interpret the language of his silences when he was too tired or too medicated to speak. Understanding from the crease between his eyebrows when he was in pain, from the flutter of his eyelids when he was trying to stay awake to listen to just one more chapter. I'd dab his forehead with a cool cloth and listen to his shallow breaths, my own heart aching in rhythm. We'd watch old westerns on the small TV in his room, and sometimes he'd reach for my hand, his grip weak but insistent, and we'd sit like that for hours without needing words. In those final brutal months, we were a team, or so I thought. She was the strategist, I was the frontline nurse. We were fighting the same war, just on different fronts. Clara would sweep in with updates about clinical trials and insurance approvals, spending maybe 30 minutes before rushing back to the office. I'd spend entire days, sometimes sleeping in the chair beside his bed when he had bad nights. At least, that's what I told myself. After he passed, the silence he left behind was immense, a hollow echoing space in our lives that no amount of busyness could fill. We moved through the funeral and the following weeks in a dense fog of shared grief. The service had been standing room only. Dad had known everyone in town, had been generous with loans to struggling business owners, had sponsored little league teams, and donated to every charity that asked. Mom was utterly adrift. A ship without a rudder, moving through her days and a daze. She'd stand in front of his closet for long minutes, touching his shirts, unable to decide what to do with them. She'd set the table for 4 at dinner, before remembering, tears streaming down her face as she put away the extra plate. Clara was her anchor, handling the estate with the same cool efficiency she handled everything else. She arranged for a cleaning service, organized the paperwork, scheduled meetings with lawyers and accountants. She moved through the chaos with purpose, and we all leaned on her strength. I trusted her. We all did. She was the responsible one, the one who knew how to navigate the complicated, heart-wrenching aftermath of a life. She'd talk about Dad's wishes with an air of solemn, unassailable authority, as if she'd been privy to secret conversations the rest of us hadn't had. Dad wanted to make sure Mom was secure above all else, she'd say, and we'd all nod, our grief making us pliable. He wanted the company to continue as his legacy, intact and strong, she'd insist, her gaze firm and unwavering. He made some changes in those final months, clarifying his intentions. It all sounded so reasonable, so loving. I never imagined that behind that curtain of competence, she was meticulously rewriting our family's story, casting herself as the sole heir and me as the charity case who needed to be managed. That misplaced document in his study wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a key, unlocking a hidden windowless room in our family's house where Clara had been secretly building her empire of lies. I took the document home that night, my hands still shaking, my mind racing through memories of the past 6 months with new, horrible clarity. I spread it out on my kitchen table under the harsh fluorescent light and photographed every inch of it with my phone, making sure Clara's handwriting was clearly visible, that every damning note was captured. The evidence was undeniable. Clara's handwriting, her suggestions, her systematic dismantling of the equal inheritance our parents had always promised. But having proof wasn't enough. I needed to understand the full scope of what she'd done, to see the complete picture of her betrayal before I could decide how to fight back. I spent the next 3 days going through every file in Dad's study, every email on his computer, every scrap of paper in his desk drawers. I became a detective in my own family history, and what I found made my blood run cold. Clara hadn't just influenced the will. She'd orchestrated an entire campaign of manipulation. Email after email from Dad's account to the lawyer, all written in Clara's distinctively formal tone, discussing concerns about my financial irresponsibility and my inability to manage large sums. But Dad didn't write like that. He wrote in fragments, with terrible spelling and an overuse of exclamation points that made everything seem excited or urgent. Clara says Amelia is having money troubles, one email read. Need to make sure she's protected from herself. Can we set up a trust? But Dad had never mentioned anything about money troubles to me. Because there weren't any. My business was doing fine, not making me rich, but paying my bills and allowing me to save a little each month. I found bank statements showing Clara had been taking shareholder loans from the company for years. Loans that were essentially salary bonuses she'd been paying herself without board approval. The amounts were staggering. $30,000 here, $50,000 there. Over 5 years, she'd taken over $200,000. She'd been embezzling in plain sight, wrapping theft in corporate terminology that Dad, who trusted her completely with the financial operations, never questioned. And then I found the timeline that made everything click into place. In the 6 months between that preliminary draft and Dad's death, Clara had systematically isolated him from everyone who might contradict her narrative. She'd convinced him to stop taking calls from his old friends, citing his need for rest and claiming the conversations tired him out. She'd rearranged his medications and his schedule so that I was never alone with him during his lucid hours. I'd arrived to find him heavily sedated from his afternoon pain medication. Or, Clara would schedule my visits right before his scheduled naps. Every visit I made during those final months, Clara had been there, hovering, managing, controlling the narrative. When I tried to discuss estate planning with Dad one afternoon, wanting to make sure he was comfortable with whatever decisions he was making, Clara had interrupted within minutes. "Don't tire him out with business talk, Amelia. He needs to rest." She'd ushered me out of the room, her hand firm on my elbow, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. I'd thought she was being protective. I'd been grateful for her efficiency. I'd been a fool. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't the hot explosion of sudden anger. It was the cold, methodical fury of someone who'd been played for years. Clara had weaponized our father's illness, his confusion, his trust. She'd turned his last months into a heist, and I'd been too busy grieving to notice. But if I went to my mother with this information now, grief-stricken and still dependent on Clara for everything from managing the bills to organizing her weekly grocery delivery, she'd never believe me. Clara would spin it as jealousy, as my resentment of her success, as me manufacturing evidence because I couldn't accept that Dad had changed his mind about me. I needed more than proof. I needed an airtight case. I needed allies. I needed Clara to hang herself with her own rope. So I did something I'd never done before. I became strategic. I became patient. I became exactly the kind of person Clara had always underestimated me to be. I started with Dad's old lawyer, Mr. Abernathy. He'd been handling Dad's legal affairs for 30 years, a grandfatherly man with a practice in a converted Victorian house downtown. But Clara had convinced Dad to switch to her own corporate attorney 6 months before he died. A slick man named Harrison who specialized in complex estate planning and worked out of a glass tower in the financial district. That switch alone was suspicious. I called Abernathy's office and made an appointment, bringing with me the preliminary draft and copies of the emails. His secretary, a woman who'd known our family for decades, had squeezed my hand when I arrived. "I'm so sorry about your father, dear. He was a good man." The old lawyer's face had darkened as he reviewed the materials, his reading glasses slipping down his nose as he studied page after page. "Your father called me 4 months before he passed," Abernathy said, his voice heavy with regret. He was confused, said Clara had convinced him to make some changes to his will, but he wanted to check with me first. He said something didn't feel right about it. Said Clara was being very insistent, very pushy, and that wasn't like her. What did you tell him? I told him to wait, to not sign anything until his head was clearer, until he could think it through without medication clouding his judgment. I told him I'd come to the house to discuss it, that we could review everything together, like we always had. He paused, looking pained, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he set down the papers. Clara called me the next day. She said Richard didn't want to see me anymore, that I'd upset him by questioning his decisions. She said he was switching to Harrison's firm and that my services were no longer needed. She was very firm, very final. Did you try to reach him directly? I did. Multiple times. I called the house every day for a week, but every call went to Clara. She said he was too ill, too tired, that I was causing him stress by not respecting his wishes. She said I was making his last months harder by refusing to accept that he'd moved on professionally. Abernathy looked at me with sadness and recognition. I should have tried harder. I should have driven over there, pushed past her if I had to. But I didn't want to upset a dying man if he truly didn't want to see me. I thought I was respecting his wishes. I didn't realize I was being shut out. He agreed to help me to review the final will that Clara had Dad sign and compare it to the decades of estate planning documents he had on file. What he found was damning. The final will was completely inconsistent with everything Dad had established over 30 years of meticulous planning. It gave Clara controlling interest in the company and the bulk of the liquid assets, leaving me with a modest trust that would pay out $1,000 a month until I turned 45, at which point I could access the principal, which amounted to just $180,000 from an estate worth over $4 million. $1,000 a month. For 15 years. From an estate our parents had built together, that they'd always promised to split equally. This will could be challenged, Abernathy said carefully, pulling out a legal pad and making notes in his precise handwriting. There's clear evidence of undue influence. Your father's medical records would show his cognitive state during the time these changes were made. The switch in legal representation, the isolation from longtime advisors, the timing, it all points to manipulation. But litigation is expensive, emotionally devastating, and the outcome is never certain. Probate court is its own special kind of hell. I don't want litigation, I said, and I meant it. The thought of dragging our family through a public court battle, of having Dad's final months dissected by strangers, made me feel sick. I want justice, and I want Clara to know exactly what she's lost. Over the next 2 months, I built my case with the precision of a surgeon. I became someone I'd never been before, methodical, strategic, relentless. Every evening after work, I'd spend hours compiling evidence, making calls, following paper trails. My art sat untouched in my studio, my freelance work the bare minimum to pay bills. This had become my full-time job. I interviewed Dad's nurses from hospice who remembered Clara's controlling presence and her insistence on managing all of Dad's communications. One nurse, a kind woman named Grace, with tired eyes and gentle hands, recalled Clara literally taking Dad's phone away during a lucid moment when he'd asked to call his friend Tom. She said he was too confused, that he'd just upset himself trying to explain his condition. Grace told me over coffee, her voice low. But he wasn't confused that day. He was sharp. I remember because we'd been talking about the Tigers game, and he'd been making jokes. He wanted to call his friend, and she just took the phone, said she'd handle it. I thought it was strange, but families handle end of life differently. I didn't think it was my place to intervene. I contacted Dad's old friends from the Rotary Club. Men who'd known him for 40 years, who'd built businesses alongside him, who'd celebrated successes and weathered failures together. They'd all been frozen out during his final months. Each one had received the same message from Clara. Dad was too ill for visitors. He needed peace and quiet. None of them had been allowed to say goodbye. I tried to visit 3 times, said Bill Murray, who'd started his plumbing business the same year Dad opened his first store. Clara turned me away at the door every time. Said he was sleeping, said he'd specifically asked not to be disturbed. I left cards, left messages, but I never heard back. I thought maybe he was angry with me about something, but I couldn't figure out what. It wasn't until the funeral that I realized he probably never knew I'd tried to visit. I hired a forensic accountant recommended by Abernathy, a sharp woman named Patricia Chen, who specialized in corporate fraud. Within a week, she'd identified over $200,000 in questionable shareholder loans Clara had taken over 5 years. None of them had been properly documented or approved by the board, which consisted of Dad, Clara, and 2 outside members who rarely attended meetings. "These are textbook embezzlement," Patricia said, showing me highlighted spreadsheets that made my head spin. She structured them to look legitimate, proper paperwork, proper terminology. But the board approval is fabricated. Look at the signatures on these authorization forms. That's not your father's signature. The slant is wrong, the pressure is inconsistent. Someone traced it. Clara had been forging Dad's signature for years, paying herself bonuses without approval. And Dad, who'd trusted her completely with the financial operations, had never noticed. But the most powerful evidence came from an unexpected source. One of Dad's friends, Tom Chen, had been visiting the week before Dad signed the final will. Clara had been out of the house for once, a rare company emergency that couldn't be handled remotely, and Tom had spent an hour alone with Dad. He was sharp that day, Tom told me over coffee in a diner near his auto shop, his eyes wet with memory. His hands, stained with years of engine grease that never quite washed out, trembled as he held his mug. Sharp as he'd been in months. The kind of day when I could almost pretend he wasn't dying, you know? And he told me, Amelia, he told me very clearly that he was worried about Clara. Said she'd been pressuring him about the will, that she wanted him to give her the company outright. He said he didn't want to do it, that it wasn't fair to you, but she kept telling him you couldn't handle the responsibility. Did he say anything else? He said, "I'm going to call Abernathy. Something's not right here. Clara's being too pushy, and that's not like her. Something's wrong." Those were his exact words. He made me write down Abernathy's number, said he might forget it later. But then Clara came home early, and she got upset that I was there. She said I was tiring him out, that she'd specifically asked people not to visit without calling first. She asked me to leave, and her tone, it wasn't a request. Tom's voice cracked. That was the last time I saw him. He signed that will 3 days later. I've been carrying guilt about that conversation ever since, wondering if I should have done something, said something. But what? She was his daughter. I was just an old friend. I recorded the interview with Tom's permission, had it transcribed, notarized, and sworn as a legal statement. Tom was willing to testify if needed. His guilt over not intervening now transformed into determination to set things right. By the time I was done, I didn't just have evidence. I had an airtight case that would destroy Clara's credibility completely. I had witnesses, documentation, forensic analysis, and a timeline that showed systematic manipulation and isolation. I had proof of embezzlement, forgery, and undue influence, but I still needed the final piece. I needed my mother to see it, to understand what Clara had done before Clara could spin the narrative and turn Mom against me. I invited Mom to my apartment on a Saturday afternoon when I knew Clara would be busy at the company. She'd mentioned a board meeting in one of her terse family update emails. Mom came, still moving through the world like she was underwater, her grief a weight that bent her shoulders and made her seem decades older than her 62 years. She wore one of Dad's old cardigan sweaters over her dress, the sleeves hanging past her hands, and I had to swallow hard against the lump in my throat. I made her tea the way she liked it, Earl Grey with honey and a splash of milk, and sat with her on my small couch, the afternoon sun streaming through my windows and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. "Mom," I said gently, taking her hand, "I need to show you something, and I need you to look at it with clear eyes, okay? I need you to really see it, even though it's going to hurt." She nodded, her hands wrapped around the warm mug, steam rising and obscuring her face for a moment. I showed her everything. The preliminary draft with Clara's notes, the emails written in Dad's name but in Clara's voice, the bank statements showing the embezzlement, Tom's sworn statement, Abernathy's legal analysis, the timeline of Clara's isolation tactics, the forensic accountant's report, the statements from nurses and friends who'd been shut out. I laid it all out like pieces of a puzzle, and I watched my mother's face as she processed it all. Each document, another piece clicking into place until the full, terrible picture emerged. I watched denial turn to confusion, confusion turn to recognition, recognition turned to a grief so profound it made her physically sway. She set down her tea with shaking hands, and for a long moment, she couldn't speak. She did this to her own father, Mom finally whispered, her voice breaking like glass. While he was dying, while he was scared and sick and vulnerable, she used that. She weaponized his illness. Yes, she lied to all of us. To me, to you, to him. She looked me in the eye every single day and lied. Mom's hands were fists now, clutching Dad's cardigan. She sat at our dinner table and planned this. She sat by his hospital bed and plotted how to steal from her own sister. Yes, and I believed her. I trusted her with everything. I let her handle all of it because I was too weak, too grief-stricken to function, and she used that too. Tears were streaming down Mom's face now, and she wasn't bothering to wipe them away. What kind of mother raises a child who could do this? This isn't your fault, Mom. You didn't do this. Clara did. This was her choice, her betrayal. Mom was quiet for a long time, tears streaming silently down her face, her breathing shallow and uneven. When she finally spoke, her voice was steel, wrapped in sorrow. What do you want to do? I want to confront her. With you there. With Abernathy there. I want her to see what she's lost, and I want her to know we know exactly what she did. I want her to look us both in the eye and try to explain how she could do this to Dad, to our family, to everything we believed in. Mom nodded slowly, and something changed in her expression. The soft, grief-stricken widow hardened into something else. A mother whose child had been wronged, whose husband's memory had been desecrated. Set it up. The meeting happened 2 weeks later in Abernathy's conference room, in that converted Victorian that smelled of old wood and lemon polish and justice. Clara walked in expecting a simple estate settlement meeting, a formality to finalize the paperwork before the assets were distributed. She wore one of her power suits, navy blue with crisp white blouse, her hair pulled back in a perfect bun, her expression one of cool, professional competence. She'd brought her own leather portfolio, probably filled with documents she'd prepared, her own version of events ready to be presented as fact. She stopped short when she saw me and Mom already seated at the table with Abernathy. Her eyes darted between us, quick calculations happening behind that professional mask. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone carrying just a hint of irritation beneath the surface calm. "I thought this was just the three of us for the final signatures." "Sit down, Clara," Mom said quietly, and there was something in her voice that made Clara's confident posture falter. Clara sat, her posture perfect, her face a mask of confused concern that she'd perfected over years of practice. "Is something wrong?" "We found something," I said, sliding the preliminary draft across the polished mahogany table to her. "In Dad's study, in his copy of Moby Dick, the book he was reading in those final weeks." I watched the color drain from her face as she recognized her own handwriting, as she saw her margin notes exposed to the light, but she recovered quickly. Clara always did. That mask slipped back into place. "I don't know what this is supposed to prove," she said, her voice measured and calm. "I was helping Dad organize his thoughts about the estate. He was confused. The medication made it hard for him to focus, and I was trying to clarify his wishes. That's what a good daughter does." "You were rewriting his will to cut me out," I interrupted, my voice steady. "You convinced him I was irresponsible. You told him I couldn't handle money. You systematically destroyed my relationship with him during the last months of his life, feeding him lies about me while I sat by his bedside, reading him Steinbeck." "That's not true. Dad made his own decisions. He was the one who had concerns about your financial stability." "Dad didn't write these emails, Clara." I slid the printed emails across the table, each one highlighted and annotated. "You did. You used his account, but you wrote them. Your writing style, your vocabulary, your corporate speak. Facilitate, implement, financial optimization. Dad never used those words. He said do, make it happen, save money. You wrote these emails and you signed his name." Abernathy cleared his throat, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of legal experience. I've reviewed the final will against 30 years of your father's estate planning documents, Clara. The changes are completely inconsistent with his expressed wishes and his established pattern of thought. Your father valued fairness above almost everything. Moreover, I have a sworn statement from Thomas Chen, who spoke with your father 3 days before the will was signed. Your father explicitly stated he was concerned about your pressure and wanted to consult with me before making any changes. The next day, you called to fire me. Clara's composure was starting to crack, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. You're ganging up on me. You're twisting everything because you're jealous. We also have the company's financial records, I continued, my voice calm and steady even as my heart hammered. Specifically, the $200,000 in unauthorized shareholder loans you've taken over the past 5 years. We have a forensic accountant's report showing that the board approvals were forged, that Dad's signature was traced, not written. That's embezzlement, Clara. That's fraud. That's prison time. Her face went white as paper, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. So here's what's going to happen, I said, leaning forward, holding her gaze. You're going to sign an agreement restoring the estate to Dad's original intent, equal split between us, just like he always promised. You're going to repay every dollar you stole from the company with interest. And you're going to do it quietly, without a fight, because if you don't, I'm taking all of this evidence to the police and to a probate judge, and you will go to jail. And believe me, Clara, I have enough evidence to put you away for years. You can't, she started, but her voice cracked. I can, I said softly, and I will. You underestimated me, Clara. You thought I'd be too weak, too grief-stricken, too disorganized to fight back. You thought you knew me. But you were wrong. Mom spoke then, her voice heavy with a disappointment more potent than any anger. How could you do this to your father, to your own sister? You sat by his bedside. You held his hand. You looked him in the eye every single day, and the whole time you were stealing from him, lying to him, manipulating him when he was at his most vulnerable. How? Tears welled in Clara's eyes, not tears of remorse, but tears of rage and humiliation and fury at being caught. I gave my entire life to that company, she cried, her voice cracking, the careful composure finally shattering like the thin veneer it had always been. To Dad's legacy, what has she ever done? She plays with paints and computers in her little apartment while I worked. 70-hour weeks. I sacrificed. I gave up everything. I was there every single day, putting out fires, making the hard decisions, building that company into something worth inheriting. I earned it. I deserved it more than someone who couldn't even commit to a real career. It was the first truly honest thing she had said. The poison of her long-held resentment, the jealousy she'd masked with condescending concern for decades, finally spilled out. All those years, her efficiency, her responsibility, it had all been tangled up with a deep, bitter conviction that her life path was the only one of value, that her sacrifices entitled her to everything. She didn't just want the money, she wanted to win. She wanted it declared, officially and financially, that she was the better daughter, the deserving one, the one whose choices mattered. A legacy is not a building or a bank account, Clara, I said softly, the adrenaline in my veins turning to a cold, weary sadness. It's the values you leave behind. It's the love you cultivate. It's the trust you honor. Dad believed in fairness. He believed in family. He believed in integrity. You set fire to all of that just to get what you wanted. You destroyed what actually mattered to prove you deserved what didn't. Abernathy, seeing his moment, intervened. He slid the settlement agreement across the table toward her, the papers crisp and final. Clara, he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its professional authority, the evidence Amelia has gathered is substantial and damning. Contesting the will would be inadvisable. This agreement restores the estate to your father's original intent, equal distribution as he always intended. It also includes a repayment plan for the embezzled funds. It is my professional and legal recommendation that you sign it. Today? Now. Clara stared at the document, then at the three of us, a jury that had already delivered its verdict. Her face was a storm of warring emotions, fury at being outmaneuvered, defeat at being caught, and utter disbelief that her meticulously crafted plan had been so completely and quietly dismantled. She had been so sure of my weakness, of my mother's passivity, of the world's acceptance of her carefully constructed narrative. She never imagined that my silence was not acquiescence, but observation. My quietness was not a void, but a crucible where something harder and stronger was being forged. She snatched a pen from the holder on the table. Her signature was a vicious, angry slash of ink, tearing a small hole in the paper where she pressed too hard. She shoved the document back across the table, stood up so abruptly her chair scraped loudly against the floor, and fixed me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "I hope you're happy," she spat, her carefully modulated voice now raw and ugly. "This isn't about happiness, Clara," I replied, my voice holding no triumph, only the deep, weary sadness of our fractured family, of the sister I'd lost long before this moment. "It's about the truth. It's about honoring who Dad actually was, not who you wanted him to be." She didn't say another word. She turned and walked out of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, out of the office and out of our lives, leaving behind not the scent of victory, but the stale, toxic air of her own scorched earth campaign. In the end, Clara took the money and vanished. She sold her shares of the company to a competitor for a premium price, took her half of the inheritance, and moved to the other side of the country, Seattle, we heard through a distant relative. There was no tearful goodbye, no last-ditch attempt at an apology, no final confrontation where she admitted her wrongs. She simply faded away, communicating only through terse emails from her lawyer regarding the logistics of the asset division. She became a ghost in our family photos, a hollow space where a sister used to be. Mom took down the pictures that included her, unable to look at that smiling face without seeing the betrayal beneath it. But my life, once clouded by her long oppressive shadow, was finally filled with light. The inheritance wasn't a prize to be gloated over. It was a tool, a means to an end. It wasn't a finish line marking some victory, but a starting block for building something new. I didn't buy a fancy car or a sprawling house in the suburbs. I didn't take revenge trips or make showy purchases. I bought freedom. I bought the building downtown I'd always dreamed of, a 3-story brick structure with huge north-facing windows on the top floor that flooded the space with the soft, consistent light, perfect for creating art. The building had been a print shop once, and it still smelled faintly of ink and paper and possibilities. I named it the Jensen Studio, not for the family business name that Clara had coveted and abandoned, but for the man who, despite his confusion at the end, despite being manipulated and deceived, had always just told me to be happy. It was the legacy he would have wanted, not a hardware empire, but a space where beauty could be created, where artists could gather, where dreams could take shape. My mother and I became collaborators in this new chapter of our lives. She, with her impeccable art historian's taste and her decades of teaching experience, helped me design the interior. We spent weekends covered in drywall dust and paint splatters, hunting for furniture in antique shops and estate sales, drinking coffee on the dusty floor while sitting on overturned buckets, making plans for workshops and gallery shows, and community art classes. We talked more in those few months than we had in the past decade. We spoke of Dad. Not just his illness and his death, but his life. His terrible jokes that made everyone groan. His love for fishing on his old boat, the Wanderer, which he'd kept docked at the marina even though he only used it twice a year. The way he hummed off-key when he was happy, usually some old Johnny Cash song he'd heard on the radio. The time he'd tried to surprise Mom with breakfast in bed and set off the smoke alarm making bacon. We were rebuilding our family on a new foundation. One of unvarnished honesty and mutual respect and hard-won trust. Justice, I learned, isn't a single thunderous moment of victory in a lawyer's office. It's a quiet, ongoing process of rebuilding what was torn down, of healing what was broken, of honoring what was lost. It was in the hum of my new large-format printer as it produced the first run of posters for a local arts festival. It was in the proud look on my mother's face as she hung one of my large, abstract canvases in her living room, right where a formal portrait of Clara used to be. A photograph of 3-year-old Clara in a white dress, looking perfect and untouchable even then. It was in the easy, uncomplicated laughter we shared over the phone, no longer filtered through a third party's manipulative narrative. It was in Mom texting me silly memes she'd discovered, her grief slowly giving way to moments of lightness. One afternoon, about a year after the confrontation, I was standing in the middle of my studio on the third floor. The late-day sun slanted through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny golden sparks. The smell of turpentine and linseed oil filled the room, a scent that to me would always smell like possibility, like freedom, like home. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Mom, a picture of the canvas in her living room with the sun hitting it just right, the blues and golds seeming to glow from within. Thinking of you. Your father would be so proud. I looked around at the life I was building, a life I'd fought for, not with shouting and anger and courtroom theatrics, but with quiet truth and patient investigation and unwavering determination. Clara had tried to write my story for me, casting me as the fragile, incompetent artist who needed to be managed and contained and protected from her own foolish choices. She thought I was a footnote, someone who would accept their small portion and fade away into obscurity, someone too weak to fight back. But she was wrong. My quiet plan hadn't just unraveled her scheme, it had unraveled me from the suffocating tapestry of her expectations and her control. I wasn't a footnote in the family story. I was the author of my own life, and I was writing it in bold, beautiful strokes, and in the peaceful, sunlit silence of my own studio, surrounded by my own work, born from my own vision and my own voice, I finally had the freedom to write whatever future I wanted. The inheritance was finite, money in an account that would eventually be spent. But that closure, that reclaimed trust, that hard-won freedom, that was infinite. That would compound with interest for the rest of my life. And it was all mine.